Hey everyone, that review guy here. Today I just thought I'd do a different type of style of video since you guys seem to like the flanderization video, and I kind of want to start doing more videos in that type of vein. So if you guys like this type of stuff, let me know in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's get started. Black and white, good guy, bad guy, hero, villain, whatever you want to call them. These are two opposing forces that are always clashing with each other. And today I just thought I'd take a look at what makes a good villain, since we're always looking through the lens of a protagonist slash hero. And I kind of just want to take a look at what really makes a good villain, since, you know, I've been seeing a lot of movies and TV shows where the villain is, you know, a little bit different from your stereotypical villain, and I kind of just want to see what makes these good villains. So without further ado, let's get into this. What is a villain? Now, I know most of you probably yelling at your screen, reviewer, they're the bad guy, they're the evil person of the story. And while I do agree to some extent, I want to differentiate basically what it means to be a villain and what it means to be a protagonist. A villain definition is basically a character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot. And I do kind of agree to a point where a villain is a person that does do bad things and, you know, are out to hurt other people. I kind of did want to differentiate them from the antagonist. However, like, to me, a villain is someone who, yes, while they do hurt the main protagonist, they do hurt others as well. They don't just target the main protagonist. You know, they target his friends, they target, you know, innocent bystanders, etc. They don't just target the main protagonist, in my opinion. An antagonist, however, is someone who basically is a person that just directly opposes the protagonist, and they don't even have evil intentions at heart. Like, for example, you know, in Pokemon, Ash will go up against like his friend rival, you know, and that friend rival will be the antagonist. That doesn't mean they're a villain or anything, or, you know, they don't have like evil intentions, but they are opposing him. So again, I just kind of wanted to differentiate what it means to be a villain slash an antagonist. Like, to me, they are two different things. Other than that, not really. A villain can also be the protagonist as well. I thought I'd, you know, point that out. Like, a villain doesn't necessarily have to be someone other than the protagonist. Like, the protagonist can also be the villain, and I'll probably go deeper into that later, since, you know, there was a certain game I played that, you know, is really good and really portrays that concept well, which I'll talk about later. But other than that, that's all I have to say for what makes a villain. Again, to sum it up, it's basically a person with evil intent out to hurt others. That's all. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get into the motivation. I'll try to make this brief, but the motivation is basically the reason why a character does what they do. To me, a motivation can be silly as long as it matches up to the story. Like, for example, in Scooby-Doo, the villain is almost always doing something silly, but it matches up with the rest of the story. Like, you know, none of it really makes sense, and, you know, Scooby-Doo isn't a cartoon that's taken too seriously. So the motivations for the characters in, you know, each of the stories are silly and, you know, out there, but it matches up with the rest of the atmosphere of the show, which is pretty cool. Again, and the motivation has to make sense in the context of a story, like I just, you know, briefly mentioned. Like, the motivation can't just come out of nowhere, to me, in my opinion. Like, it has to make sense to the story. It can't just be some made up motivation, or like some motivation that, you know, doesn't make sense to the story. Like, it has to make sense and matches up with the story. So, like, when it's revealed why a villain does what they do, it isn't just out of left field and out of nowhere. It's like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, because, you know, I've seen stories where they have to give the villain a motivation because, you know, they have to be whatever the main character's after. Like, say, for example, the main character is after like some sort of MacGuffin, and, you know, there was no villain to stop them. But nope, all of a sudden they need the villain to want the MacGuffin too. Like, why? Just have it make sense from the beginning. Anyway, that's all I have to say in terms of motivations. Again, I don't think it has to be too complicated or whatever. A motivation can be simple, it can be complicated. It doesn't really matter as long as it matches up with the story, in my opinion. Anyway, let's move on to the appearance. We associate them with these colors. You know, darker colors mean, like, you know, a darker side of things, and, you know, we usually associate dark things with, you know, villains. And I feel like those play self-explanatory. Villains usually strike fear when they're well built, such as, you know, Bane from Batman, Bowser from Mario. I don't think a villain needs to be essentially a brute to strike fear, but they usually do well, since, you know, we're always thinking to ourselves, oh shoot, will the main protagonist be able to beat them, since, you know, they're usually weak in comparison, usually. I feel as though a villain can be tiny and menacing as well, as long as they have, as long as they have some sort of power, such as like Lord Commander from Final Space. You know, I feel as though, you know, tiny villains can be just as menacing if they have some sort of power. Even Ludo from Star Versus has like his army of monsters, which makes him be able to be taken much more seriously. And darker voices are usually associated with villains as well, since, you know, they're menacing and scary, and, you know, they usually strike fear as well, since, you know, it's like, oh shoot, that voice sounds scary. So again, deeper voices are usually associated with villains as well. And yeah, that's all really have to say in terms of the appearance, their looks, their voice, their built. These are good things that make up a villain, but they don't necessarily have to have all of these. You don't necessarily have to have all of these components to make a good villain, but they are usually associated with a good villain, since, you know, these are essential things that make them menacing and scary. Anyway, that's all I have to say. For the appearance, let's move on to the association. In terms of the associations, I feel as though a villain can have a lot of impact when they're close to the main character, either through family relations, or, you know, being their friend, or just being someone they knew. So I feel as though a villain can have a great impact on the main protagonist if they're someone they knew. That's not to say that's the only relation that they have to have impact. I also think it's really great for a main character to create the villain, such as in Incredibles, since, you know, it builds depth towards the villain, and makes the protagonists question themselves if they have good morals, if they're a good person. Lastly, I think it's really good for the villain to be the main protagonist, since it makes us, the audience, question whether or not they're really doing good things, such as in Spec Ops: The Line, where it's kind of revealed, spoiler alert, that, you know, our main protagonist was just kind of imagining things the whole time, and, you know, those difficult decisions he made, we have to question if they were morally right. So yeah, with that out of the way, that's all we have to say for the associations. So I'm going to go into a mini rant in a little bit, and then I'm going to go into a conclusion. So without further ado, let's get started. Before we get into the conclusion, I thought I'd just briefly mention this. In terms of twist villains, I have no problem with twist villains as long as they make sense to the story and don't come out of nowhere because the story all of a sudden needs one. Frozen. But again, I don't really have a problem with twist villains. Again, I feel as though they can be utilized really well. A good game that actually did it pretty decently, in my opinion, was probably like Danganronpa, where spoiler alert, it was revealed to be Junko all along. Oh. But anyway, I feel as though, again, but that made context, you know, to the story, because, you know, they switched places and whatnot, so like it made sense for her to be the villain in the end. But that's what I'm saying, like twist villains like that, or I don't even know if you would call her a twist villain, but, you know, where it's like twist villains like her, or even just twist villains like that in general, where at least they gave some hint of them, you know, being in the story, and, you know, them being sort of evil. Like if the story gives them a hint at being evil, then that's fine, or even, you know, it gives subtle hints as to who or what is being evil, then that's fine. But if you're just making a twist villain because the story all of a sudden needs an antagonist, or all of a sudden needs a villain because, you know, the characters are, you know, almost about to reach their goal, then no, I don't think twist villains are necessarily, I don't think a twist villain should be used in that sort of way. They should only really be used if, you know, it makes sense to the story, and, you know, there isn't like a looming threat, like an obvious looming threat or something like that. Anyway, that's all I have to say for the twist villain mini rant. Anyway, I'm going to head into conclusions, so without further ado, let's get started. In conclusion, I feel as though villains are an integral part of the story and can either be used right or wrong depending on the storyteller. You know, you can use a villain in a good way, pun intended, or a bad way. So again, that's all I have to say. Hopefully you guys will use these kind of tips if you are planning to write stories, or even planning to just, you know, maybe you can, like, you know, recall on this kind of stuff when you're watching a film or anything like that. So yeah, thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe, and yeah, I'll see you all later. All right, everyone, peace out.